Hello everyone. Now, I'm going to be doing a book review first of all, but I'm going to have to warn you because I might suddenly jump up and start shouting. Please forgive me if I do, but I'll explain to you why that is. Watch this. Ah yes. Holland is playing France and they're 2-0 ahead. Yippee! So it's looking good for Holland. But anyway, I'm not a big football fan, to be honest, but I do like to sort of follow. Oh shit! Fucking bastards have scored. Two one. Look at this. That's just amazing. Like within a minute, 2 goals within 1 minute. So it's 3-1 to Holland now. When I started talking to you guys, this is amazing. When I started talking to you guys, it was 2-0 to Holland. Now it's 3-1. Isn't that just mad? Anyway. Now, with all that excitement out of the way, can you believe that? 2 goals in 1 minute. Anyway, with all that out of the way, I want to start on my book review. Now, the book that I want to review with you, and that was almost another goal. The book that I want to review with you is this one. It's called Why People Believe Weird Things by Michael Shermer. And it deals with pseudoscience, superstition, and other confusions of our time. Here it is. What is so special about this book? Well, it is effectively a skeptic's handbook. This man, Michael Shermer, is one of the best known skeptics of our time. He is, as it says on the back, the founding publisher of Skeptic magazine, and you can also see his work on the website www.skeptic.com. He's a columnist for Scientific American. He has written Think Like a Math Genius with Arthur Benjamin. He is pretty well versed in the field of skepticism, basically. He knows what he's talking about. But just don't just take my word for it, read for yourself. So if you open his book, it gets very interesting very quickly. He has subdivided the book into a number of parts. Part 1 is called Science and Skepticism. Part 2, Pseudoscience and Superstition. Part 3, Evolution and Creationism. And Part 4, which I found very interesting and which is quite an appropriate thing to be talking about in the context of what has been happening here on YouTube recently, History and Pseudo-History. And on Part 5, Hope Springs Eternal. The most important parts in this book, in my opinion, are Part 1 and Part 4, I would say. Not that Part 2 and 3 aren't important, don't get me wrong, but most people have a good grip of what goes on in Parts 2 and 3. Part 1 is about science and skepticism. It starts with a chapter called I Am, Therefore I Think, and he calls it a Skeptic's Manifesto. But then he goes on in chapters 2 and 3, first of all explaining how science works, the mechanisms that underlie science, and what differentiates science from pseudoscience. And chapter 3 basically lists the most common fallacies that people use, the most common mind traps, tripwires in the mind, so to speak, that cause people to arrive at weird beliefs. So as he calls it, 25 fallacies that lead us to believe weird things. All of that is very important. It gives you a good idea of how to think straight, and also how to avoid not thinking straight, basically. He then goes into parts 2 and 3, which are good, but most people are quite familiar with those ideas and how to deal with them. So he talks about, for example, the paranormal, he talks about astrology, near-death experiences, people who claim to have elixirs of life, alien abductions, witch crazes, and so on, and cultism. Very good. I'll come back to the cultism later on, but that's the sort of thing he talks about. Then he talks about evolution and creationism, and he talks about the theory of evolution, how to confront creationists, the top 25 of their arguments, and 25 evolutionist answers, as he calls them, why science has been successful in court and creationism hasn't been able to wriggle its way into the science classroom, how to defend science, and again how to define science, and why creationism isn't science. All very good, but a lot of people are quite familiar with that already. But where it gets really good, I think, is part 4, as I said, history and pseudo-history, and it's very apt really in the light of what has been going on here in YouTube recently. So first of all, he talks about how pseudo-historians, people who like to twist history, like to use ideas like free speech and censorship in order to claim, basically, that their ideas are being suppressed, and why that isn't actually the case. He then goes into a very specific example, the Holocaust. And the chapter is titled, Who Says the Holocaust Never Happened? And why do they say it? And it's an overview of the Holocaust denial and Holocaust revisionist movement. And it is an essential read, I would suggest. Anybody should read that chapter and understand why it is quite reasonable and perfectly skeptical to dismiss the Holocaust denial and Holocaust revisionist movements out of hand. And he follows that with evidence titled How We Know the Holocaust Happened, and in that he debunks the deniers. 30 pages of argumentation that shows why there can be no doubt whatsoever on whether the Holocaust actually happened and whether the things people said happened in the Holocaust, like the gassing of people, the death camps and so on, whether all that was real. He then goes into racism, and that of course is also very important and very interesting, but again, these are arguments on the subject of racism. Pigeonholes and continuums is a chapter. A lot of people already know why racism is preposterous really, and why it makes no sense. So it's a good chapter, of course it is. And finally, the book ends with a part called Hope Springs Eternal, and these are the people who have this unbridled hubris about science, who think it will be able to resolve absolutely everything, who think, like for example, Frank Tipler is the example he puts in this book, who claims he has found a way of arriving at a practical form of immortality through the laws of physics. And he critically assesses his claims and also highlights how Frank Tipler's ideas are pretty much basically informed by his earlier Christian fundamentalist upbringing. Anyway, it's interesting read. And eventually, again, this is again a brilliant way of ending his book. He ends with 2 really good chapters. The first one is called Why Do People Believe Weird Things?, which is very good in itself. But more importantly, the last chapter is called Why Smart People Believe Weird Things. And it tells us the sort of traps into which people who think or who know they are intelligent would fall into and end up believing absolutely absurd nonsense. This book will inoculate you against falling into the trap of becoming, for example, a Holocaust revisionist, or believing in the supernatural, or any such nonsense. Okay, sorry for that final interruption. That was 4-1, and Holland have convincingly thrashed France. There you go. Anyway, read this book. If it's the last thing you ever do, read this book.